Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today we're going to take a look at a very nice game played recently by Sergey Fedorchuk, defeating Ruslan Ponomariov. So Ponomariov, of course, one of the strongest players in the world, well over 2,700, and has been for most of the past, well, more than a decade, I think. Ponomariov, of course, most famously won the FIDE Knockout World Championship in, I believe it was 2002, and he was only 18 at the time. So a very young guy, obviously. He's still a reasonably young man. Came very close this past World Cup to making the candidate. So I think he lost in the semifinal or the tiebreak match to Ivanchuk for the last spot. But by and large, he's had a very good year. Some bad results lately, but generally doing quite well. So this was an impressive upset by Fedorchuk. And I think instructive both in terms of the opening, although Ponomariov held on very well. I still think it's a dangerous system for black. When Ponomariov slipped just a little bit, that was all Fedorchuk needed, and he finished off in style. So let's have a look. Fedorchuk had white. This was played in, I think it's the Spanish Team Championship, and this was played in November of 2011 for those of you who are maybe watching this much later. So here we go. Fedorchuk was white, and we end up with a structure that's quite characteristic of a Najdorf very soon. So bishop to b5 check is kind of a safety first line, although it can end up being quite sharp. The most solid move for black here is bishop to d7. This tends to be a bit dull, though. And since Ponomariov outrated his opponent by about 100 points, I think he probably wanted to play for a win. So he played knight to d7. And this is, I would say, the most ambitious, but also the most dangerous of black's options. All right, now white played d4, takes, queen takes d4. And here this makes perfectly good sense because there's not going to be any knight to c6. So the queen is really well placed in the center. And if black chooses to play e5 at some later moment, he'll weaken the d5 square. So that's not really a serious concern for white either. All right, so a6, forcing white to cough up the bishop here. But again, white has a lot of space, well-placed pieces, and a lead in development too. Okay, so now Ponomariov plays e5, and this is known, and it makes sense as well. If he plays like knight f6, I mean, e5 could occur at some moment. That's always at least a possibility. So e5 is definitely black taking his fair share of the center here, but drawback of this is the d5 square. So queen to d3, and now an important move for black to play, h6. If he plays knight f6 straight away, then he always has to worry about bishop g5 and swapping. And even though black will have two bishops against two knights, white's complete control over the d5 square will still give him some chances. And what white will do, as in the game, is to swing this knight from f3 to e3, either via c4 or f1. And then it jumps in there, and then there's very nice control over both d5 and f5 for that matter. So black plays h6, preserving that knight from exchange, which in turn gives him better control over the d5 square. It doesn't help his development at the moment, but black realizes that white can't really exploit it. I mean, white has a good position, but white can't just crush black despite the disparity in development here. All right, so Fedorchuk gets his knight going on its little journey here. Rook c8, knight c4, queen c7, knight e3. White's position looks very pleasant. The d5 and f5 squares are both potential outposts, but still, it's not clear where they go from there. Black has some pressure along the c file, and white's remaining bishop is not a very effective piece either. In principle, if it could just sort of leap over to a3, just hop the b pawn and keep the b pawn in place, then a3 would be a very good square for it, but of course there's no way to do that, and thanks to black's massed resources on the c file, b3 is not a trivial move to achieve. Okay, now knight f6 comes, white castles, bishop e7, a4. Okay, so white would like to, first of all, prevent black from expanding on the queen side, and might even want to clamp down. And in fact, this move's a novelty, although the position hasn't really arisen that many times, so it's not surprising to have a novelty around here. Okay, Ponomariov plays queen to c5, and the idea is to support b5 as quickly as possible. Notice that black is not in any huge rush to castle, I mean, both in general and specifically right now. I mean, it's more important, he believes, and I think rightly so, that he managed to work up some counterplay quickly. All right, white plays rook to d1, and now black makes another little improvement move, bishop to e6, further taking the d5 square under control, or at least fighting for it further. White, of course, wants to be left with a good knight on d5 that can't be challenged. I mean, the ideal situation for white in terms of minor pieces goes would be to have just a knight left on d5 against just black's dark square bishop. And were that to occur and everything else to be roughly equal, white would enjoy a nice positional plus. All right, so from here, Fedorchuk played queen to e2, and I think this is a nice move. It has several points in mind. One idea is to swing the queen around to f3, and from there the queen would support knight to f5 without black being able to force white to capture the pawn. In other words, if bishop f5, white can capture back with the queen. Second point is that it gets out of the way of the rook, so white might at some point be able to double rooks on the d file, or at least certainly play a rook lift up to d3. And the point of the rook lift to d3 would also be multi-purpose. So one idea is that at some moment this rook might swing over to the king side, but a second point of the rook going to d3 is that it would enable b3, which in turn would enable this bishop from c1 to jump into the game, either on b2 or more likely on a3. So queen e2 is a very nice move. I mean, it's a subtle move. It's a retreat. It's a short move. It doesn't threaten anything directly, and so it's very easy to overlook, but it's quite a good move. All right, Ponomariov castled, and now rook to d3 as advertised. And here Ponomariov made a good move as well. He played bishop to d8, aiming to make this seemingly bad piece into quite a good one. So the bishop will either go to b6, hoping to put pressure on the a7 g1 diagonal, or maybe go to a5, which would help further impede this plan of b3 and bishop to a3. So white played queen f3, continuing with the idea of supporting knight f5. And here Ponomariov reacted, I think, to that threat rather than getting on with his own idea. So I think both options are playable, but I think it would have been better for him to go for his own counterplay with b5. One point to notice is that on knight f5, black could probably take, play b4, and then grab c2. At least that would be the obvious way that play could continue. So after b5, white might just try swapping, and then here I think white has a couple of options. One is interesting, but maybe not best. So the interesting move is b4. And this freezes black's pawn. Of course, black's not playing b4 now. And on queen takes b4, white plays rook to b1 and regains the pawn, and there's still not going to be b5, b4. However, I think that after queen takes a5, rook b5, queen a6. Well, okay, right now white's under a little bit of pressure. I mean, the threat's to play rook takes c3 and then take the rook on b5. And after rook to b1, black has a surprising exchange sack with rook takes c3. So rook c3, queen a2, and it turns out that white's position is a little bit awkward. I mean, perhaps he should play something like rook c to b3 and just return the exchange, or maybe rook to b2, but then queen a1 is kind of clumsy, and he's got to play queen to d1, and then knight takes e4 can ensue. So I'm not really sure that this b4 idea is really in white's best interest. It's attractive, it's interesting, but perhaps not fully correct. So a safer move is bishop to d2. And now after b4, knight c to d5, black can swap and ensure that white does not end up with that fantastic knight on d5 at the end of the day. Knight takes d5 is no good here because of queen c2. So e takes d5, bishop to d7, and now, for instance, rook to b3, and